Welcome to the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. Have you been following the political events that are taking place in our world? They revolve around spiritual dynamics. Sometimes it's harder to see than at other times, but it's all there. ChristianHeadlines.com published an article this week where Eric Metaxas, a best-selling author and nationally syndicated radio host, was featured. He has spent his early career writing children's books and video scripts for Rabbit Ears Production and Veggie Tales before becoming a cultural commentator and author of popular biographies of religious figures like William Wilberforce and Martin Luther. At one point, he was best known for founding Socrates in the City, a series of conversations with writers and thinkers like N.T. Wright, Francis Collins, Lauren Winter, and Sir John Polkinghorne, where he developed a reputation for thoughtful commentary on faith and public life. And then he discovered Donald Trump. Since then, the once genial Christian author who penned Lyle and the Kindly Viking has become a full-throated supporter of the president and critic of the liberal forces he believes pose a threat to American culture. His latest book, Donald Builds the Wall, features a blonde-headed caveman dressed in an American flag, saving his people from the forces of evil by building a wall to keep out swamp creatures and a caravan of troublemakers. Metaxas was recently in Las Vegas to appear on a panel during a meeting of the Religion News Association. Bob Smetana, Religious News Service editor-in-chief, asked him what he thought about the state of American culture. What do you wish people would understand about your concerns for the future of the country that they don't get? Smetana responded, since the 1960s, we've kind of drifted away from some basics. And as with everything, there are some good reasons for that. But at the end of the day, some of it's gone very wrong. I think, he said, the creeping disdain for the founders, the founding vision, and the Constitution has now come to a point, unfortunately, where we no longer know what we believe. We're just going on feeling. The issue of religious liberty is the most clear example of this. It's something so basic and now something so taken for granted that we find ourselves living in a time where people hardly know what it is. The founders wouldn't just say it's possible to exercise your faith in every part of life. They would actually say it's necessary, essential. It's part of the strength of freedom. If somebody has a belief you consider backward or stupid, it is that person's right in America to hold that belief. And we should not force people to believe things. But that's exactly where we are. The liberal mindset has become the publicly dominant American view. The media, our educational system, and much of our religious system has bought in to this counterintuitive social structure. Metaxas went on to say, in my way of thinking, it is ignorance of religious liberty and the ignorance of the founders' vision that has allowed all this to happen. And I don't think it's just bad for religious conservatives. I think it's bad for America. The issue of religious liberty often comes up in discussions when we're talking about the LGBT rights issue. Judges have begun to see discrimination against LGBT people as equivalent to racial discrimination. And despite the fact that there were, for a long time, religious arguments made for race-based discrimination, we've rejected the idea that religion could be used to justify discrimination. But applying this idea to the LGBT issue is a false equivalence. He said, to me, it's part of this victim culture that attempts to silence dissenting voices. You can't even have much of a conversation because people immediately think you must be a bigot. To actually think there are two genders is now cultural heresy. To malign Christianity, you hear about slave-owning Christians, or you hear about people using the Bible to justify slavery. Well, even though that's true, do you hear about the fact that it was what we would call today evangelical Christians who led the battle for the abolition of slave trade? They were in the front lines of saying that slavery is wrong. And you can look to the civil rights movement. It's very similar. The churches were the place where you found all of that. The ignorance of that history makes it possible for us to kind of slide into this false equivalence between LGBT folks and black Americans. At the same time, the dominant groups in the United States who practiced slavery and Jim Crow were people who took the Bible very seriously. People in the Bible Belt and Southern Baptists who believed slavery was God ordained and who used the Bible and the doctrine of Ham, Noah's son Ham, to justify it. He says, what I'm trying to say is just because selfish people have existed and have misapplied the Bible is no reason to say that everybody who is taking the Bible seriously has been misapplying it too. Is it possible that intelligent people took the Bible seriously and then misapplied it? Well, intelligent people have applied a lot of things, misapplied a lot of things. The whole point is, if you want to be sloppy and you use loud cliches to silence people, there's a lot of ammunition. But these things are way too important for that. People of faith do feel misrepresented and not listened to because of things like this, because they know, for example, they're not racist. I think there's a huge disconnect, he said. That disconnect doesn't just harm social conservatives. I really think it harms the fabric of America, because I can tell you most Christians I know, if they really see racism or injustice, get more angry about it than any secular people I know. And they would rightly be outraged by it. The idea that being a white evangelical means you are some sort of comfortable with white privilege is deeply offensive to people, because not only do they disagree with it, but their whole lives are meant to represent the opposite. Do you think there are long-term unintended consequences of the evangelical support for Trump? He's a person whose business practices and personal practices clearly do not line up with the kind of morality that evangelicals have stood for in the past. So does their association with the president harm the evangelical witness? Well, a lot of people have said that. But I have to disagree. And there are many reasons why I would disagree. He says, let's start here. For example, it's widely known that JFK routinely brought prostitutes into the White House. It wasn't something he did 10 years before being elected. He did it while he was president. And his face is still on our coinage. We even have a major airport named after him. After Kennedy came Lyndon Johnson, who behaved swinishly during his time in office. The stories are legion. We know about Lyndon Johnson. We know about all of the things that went on, and obviously Bill Clinton did too. We're not talking about in their lifetimes, but while they were in the presidency. On the other side, he says, I think that we would expect everybody in the White House to act more like Mike Pence, but we would consider that to be unrealistic. Now, when you have a leader, let's say, who commits adultery, who does something like that, if you vote for them, are you voting for adultery? Or are you voting in spite of adultery? When you vote for Trump, are you voting for every bad thing you know about him? Or are you voting for him in spite of those things? Are you looking at yourself and thinking, I'm not perfect? He says with Trump, I believe they looked at a guy like that and said, you know what? I've not lived a perfect life. I know a lot of people who have messed up their lives. So I have a different attitude today toward people who messed up their lives than I would have in the past, where I wanted everybody to be upstanding citizens and never get divorced and never do any of the other stuff. In the midst of all this, evangelicals are trying to process Donald Trump. In that process, they look at him very differently than they would have 20 years ago. I think people look at him and say, you know what? He can really be rough around the edges, and he's got some terrible stuff in his past. But looking at him now, I see a guy who actually loves this country, or seems to love this country, and in his kind of wild way, seems to care about some of this stuff that I think is vital to freedom and liberty. Am I willing to take a risk on him? Why? Well, because the alternative was Hillary Clinton. If the alternative had not been Hillary Clinton, it's possible a lot of people would have said, no, we're going to do this, we're going to go for another person. Do you think the president's use of social media is problematic? Does it exacerbate the divides that we already have in this country? I think most people who voted for Trump would prefer that he not use social media as much as he does, or in the way that he does. He said, in this vein, I wrote a biography on Martin Luther. And there are bizarre parallels. Because what happens with Trump and with Luther is that they are both incorrigible counter-punchers. And their friends, at least Luther's friends, would beg him not to do this. But he didn't seem to be able to help himself. And finding somebody attacking him, he would attack back 3 times as hard. So what do you think Bonhoffer would say about Trump? I think there's no question that from a cultural point of view, Bonhoffer would not have been a fan of Trump's style any more than George Bush Sr. is a fan of Trump's style. My study of Bonhoffer and of what happened in the 30s initially made me dislike Trump. But at some point, I began to wonder if a predictable narrative was not the real narrative. In other words, I think in the same way that the National Socialists in Germany gained the upper hand in the 30s, the cultural elites in America have slowly persuaded themselves that they are right on a number of issues. And if it means going around the electoral process, if it means going around the usual procedure, they're going to do what they have to do. I think Bonhoeffer was very lonely in his opposition to Hitler because he was trying to wake up the church. He was trying to say to them, listen, this nation's going to go down in flames. We're going to be hanging our heads in shame for 100 years unless we stand up. And if in his sometimes ham-fisted way the president is any kind of a counter force against that, you have to be glad he's there because of the mad rush toward the left. It's been so fast and so dramatic. The real issue for America has to do with what I'm calling cultural Marxism. If we don't understand this is the enemy of liberty for all Americans, then we've completely changed. It's not an issue of left versus right. It's an issue of the fundamentals. Can we have a civil place to talk about these things and disagree? We live in a country where we celebrate people's ability to hate the president in public. I celebrate that. So I'm not worried about Trump. Am I worried about the country? Oh, yeah.